So we all learned how Melchizedek, or Melchizedek was introduced in chapter 5, right? Anybody remember somebody had taught you about Melchizedek on chapter 5, right? Anybody? Yes, yes, yes. I hope you remember. So what I want to say through chapter 7 is, let me just give a brief introduction. Having introduced the author, he introduced Melchizedek in chapter 5, verse 10 and 11. Now, what the author is doing is he, temporarily put that topic aside and comes up with chapter 6, talking about, exhortation on diligence and steadfastness, and the warnings regarding, the end of the slothfulness, And then again, he comes back to chapter 6 talking about Melchizedek. You see, it's like a sandwich, or in Maharashtra we can call vada pav, right? So it's kind of a vada pav or a sandwich passage over here. Melchizedek, then chapter 6, then chapter 6, verse 20, coming back to Melchizedek. Now, why exactly is the author trying to bring back Melchizedek? You see, the writer of Hebrews mentioned Melchizedek several times already, including the Old Testament in Genesis chapter 14, and then in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 6 to 10, and then 6 to 20. Now he begins with a full-blown discussion. He comes with a full-blown discussion of Melchizedek and his relation to Christ. This provides the historical background. So just, Genesis chapter 14, in those 2 to 3 verses, 3 verses, 17, 18, 19, 20, 4 verses, these 4 verses just give us a historical background about this person named Melchizedek. Now, what does these passages in Genesis chapter 14, verse 17 to 20 gives us? Why is the author trying to bring those 4 verses back into this episode? There are 3 reasons. One is to show the moral character of Melchizedek. The second is to demonstrate his greatness. And the third is to establish the existence of another order of priesthood than that of Aaron. Please consider this note that when we talk about priesthood in Hebrews, we are not talking about the priesthood of Aaron. Please take this into your mind. So when Hebrews, the epistle to Hebrews is mentioning something about Melchizedek, it's not related to Aaronic priesthood. Now, what does this gives us? Insight into his moral character, which, we have to learn what exactly this person's name, Melchizedek, means. Melchizedek is a Hebrew word, is a Hebrew name. It's composed of 2 words, which when translated, it means king of righteousness. To be more precise, you see, the name Melchizedek is composed of 2 Hebrew words. One is Melech, that is a Hebrew word, Melech, which means king, and Sadek, that means righteousness. Together, when Melech, which means king, and Sadek, which means righteousness, these both come together to form a name known as Melchizedek, which means king of righteousness. And by interpretation too, Melchizedek was a king of righteousness. Now, he is also called a king of Salem. And since Salem stands for the Hebrew word shalom, this word is also one of the most important in our Bible. Shalom, which means peace. And, little more extra knowledge in Islamic culture, we call salam, where we say salam alaikum, peace be unto you. Now, the same way Hebrew word is also shalom. So Melchizedek is also called here king of peace. So there are 3 titles: king of righteousness, king of Salem, and king of peace. Now, the writer to Hebrews is mentioning Melchizedek. He was a king, and he was characterized by righteousness, and by his rule, by the rule of which he ruled by peace, which is, you can compare those passages with Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 and 17. His greatness is seen from the fact that he blessed Abraham. And we all know who Abraham is. He's the father of the nations, the person who received God's promises of blessings. You see, now somebody blessing Abraham should be more greater than Abraham, right? Now, righteousness and peace appear together frequently in the Old Testament scriptures. You see, for example, Psalm 72, verses 2, Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6 and 7, Zechariah chapter 9, verses 9 to 10. These verses shows us that peace and righteousness come side by side. They are inseparable. To the Hebrews, righteousness meant the faithful performing of all duties proper to a relationship. So faithful performing was their importance. That shows they were righteous. In Indian context, we say karma. The faithful performance shows the righteousness. Now, when the people maintained righteousness, peace was the result. Peace was the consequence of being righteous. So that was a positive aspect of these two words. Now, again, the term has first a spiritual significance of peace with God, and then of peace with one's fellows under God's covenant. That means you are to maintain peace with God and also peace with your fellow people. Isaiah chapter 32, verse 17 says so. Melchizedek of Salem incorporated both these concepts in his name and office. Office, I mean his responsibilities, his position. And even in this foreshadowed the Lord who is our righteousness and our peace. We can read 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 30. And we can see that in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14. Now, what do we read about Melchizedek in the passage given in Hebrews chapter 7? Let's just read some few verses. Verses 1. This Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of God Most High. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. First, his name means king of righteousness. Then also, king of Salem means king of peace, without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life. Like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Now, what is the next thing you learn about him? He was without father or mother. But it does not mean that he was not, somebody else other than the humans. He was not a supernatural being. He was not an angel. No, he was a human. But his genealogical records are not shown over here. But that he did not, it also does not mean that he did not belong to any line of priests. Without descent is better translated, without genealogy. Now, see the point just about neither beginning. If we read the verse beginning in verse 3, we see neither beginning of days nor end of life, which means that Melchizedek's priesthood is not recorded to know its origin and end. There is no beginning, there is no end. No wonder the psalmist says, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Forever. He is a lone figure who suddenly appears on the stage of history for a small moment of time. And then as suddenly as mysteriously removes from the scene, suddenly coming in and again suddenly going out. a flash of his history is just in 4 words. Now, this, no one can say of this strange man, here is the beginning of his priestly service, or here is the end of his priesthood. So this was a small introduction. Now, in the following verses, beginning from verses 4 to 10, we will just see how great Melchizedek was. The author magnifies Melchizedek by repeating or reiterating the fact that Abraham gave him the tenth of his plunder and in return received the priestly blessings. It's not the Aaronic blessings, because Aaronic priesthood was not yet formed at that time. You need to note that. Now, the son in verse 6, that is mentioned in verse 6, the sons of Levi, or the Levitical priests who received the office, they are superior to all other Israelites. Normally, if we look at the history of Israel, the priests are the supreme persons, in the temple kind of thing, in the temple worships, in the temple work, in different areas of works of temple, whether be it worship, sacrifice, offering, all. In everything, priest was the most superior person there. They take tithes because of a commandment and a law which was given. And then they also take tithes from their own brothers. They are the descendants of Abraham. Now, Abraham taking the role of accepting the tithes and blessings. Here, this Abraham doubly, 2 times acknowledged, his inferiority to Melchizedek. In simple, the author is trying to say Abraham is inferior to Melchizedek. That means Melchizedek is superior than Abraham. So this is what the author is trying to show, that Melchizedek is really of a high person. And then, therefore, it is just indisputable that the less is blessed, according to the verse given in verse 7. If we read verse 7, no wonder that the less is blessed in this sense by the better. So Abraham is the less, Melchizedek is the better. Now, if Abraham was blessed by Melchizedek, it follows that Melchizedek was a better man in terms of rank, in terms of office, than the patriarch Abraham. Both men acknowledged this relative position. They knew who they were. So Abraham paid his tithes to Melchizedek, and then Melchizedek, he blessed Abraham. Now, Abraham is greater than Levi, because he is the father of them all. But Melchizedek is greater than Abraham, if for no other reason than he both tithed and blessed Abraham. Therefore, Melchizedek is simply greater than Abraham. So now, by comparison, we should also note here in the Levitical priesthood that men that die receive tithes. It's mentioned in 1 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 49 to 53. We can see there the genealogy of the lines of the priests. But all those priests, they died. But there in Melchizedek's case, one received from them who had no successor. Melchizedek had no successor. You see, we see there is no beginning, there is no end. So henceforth, we see that, Melchizedek did not have any successor. Now, if one objects that Levi was not present in Genesis chapter 14, the writer notes that he was yet in the loins of his father, Abraham, when Melchizedek met him. That is mentioned in Genesis chapter 14 from 17 to 20. We can read there how Levites were, in the loins of his father Abraham. That too mentioned in Hebrews chapter 7. Now, just as he can say that Levi received tithes, so so he can say as well that Levi paid tithes in the person of his ancestor. Levi was forefather of the priestly tribe. Therefore, Melchizedek's priesthood was greater than Aaron's. Now, what am I simply saying is our author has dealt with Melchizedek's character as a person. Now, who is Melchizedek? In simple, Levitical priest, they also used to give tithes. But here, Melchizedek is giving tithes in the form of a blessing to Abraham. You see, this is the difference. Now, we shall see to the primary point, verses, beginning from 11 onwards. The first sentence states, if perfection. That is a key word in the epistle to Hebrews. But in this context, the perfection word means it is man's ability to draw near to God. So perfection here means somebody who is able to draw near to God. They were by Levitical priesthood. So there would have been no further need for another priest after another order, that of Melchizedek and not of Aaron. So what the author is trying to say is, in Levitical priesthood, there was always somebody after another, somebody coming one after the other to perform his task. But Melchizedek was different than the Aaronic priest. You see, and then an institution is perfect when it accomplishes the purpose for which it was instituted. But that thing was not done by Aaronic priesthood. Now, what is the purpose of a priesthood? What is exactly the purpose of a priest? The person is actually bringing men to God to atone for their sins. Now, in the following verses, the author will show clearly that the Levitical sacrifices and priesthood could not do this, either perfectly or permanently. So the author here is trying to, differentiate the works of the priesthood of Melchizedek and separating Aaronic priesthood. So what the author is trying to do is, he is showing how Levitical priesthood was weak. The Levitical priesthood was, very weak in every areas where they could not bring people to God. So they were not perfect. So we are accustomed to thinking of the priesthood as dependent on the law. Our author says the opposite. The law depended on the priesthood. This suggests, this thing suggests that in God's ordering of affairs, the priesthood was first in importance. The priesthood was important, then the law. You see, but we can see a contradiction in the history or in the time of writing to Hebrews. Their priesthood was not that important. They kept law as supreme. And that's why the author is bringing that Jesus is greater than law in the first few chapters of Hebrew. You see, we can we can connect the dots here and there. Now, verses 12, we can read there on the screen. Now, when the priesthood is changed, ultimately there is a necessity of change in the law. For example, when a foundation of a building is removed, the building obviously collapses. There can be no legal code unless there is provision for those who break it. Same is in the case of Israel. The priesthood is changed. Not only changed in terms of person, but also in the perfection. In the perfection way, Jesus is actually the new priest, showing his perfection and more greater than the Levitical priesthood. Now, there is room for thought along this line that the new law is as far superior in nature as well as the content to the old, as the new priesthood of Christ is superior to the priesthood of Aaron's sons. So simply the purpose of each law is suited to its particular priesthood. Now you see, I just want to inform or remind you that we should not be confused between the priesthood of Aaron, priesthood of Melchizedek, and priesthood of Christ. Now the author, he is beautifully explaining how he introduces the priesthood of Melchizedek and then showing Abraham lower to Melchizedek, and then Levitical order coming under him, and then bringing Jesus above the Levitical priesthood. You see, there is a big chain of differences. And from verse 13, we see he of whom these things are spoken. That's simply of Jesus Christ. The next verse will state, he belongs to another tribe. It is a very common understanding. May I ask you, which tribe does a priest belong to according to the Israelite culture? Anybody? From which tribe does a priest come from according to the Old Testament? Levites, Levitical. The priests come a tribe of Levi. You see, now he belongs to another. Jesus, he is belonging to another tribe or a different tribe from Levites or Levi. He is of a tribe from which no man ever served at the priestly altar. Do we see that the tribe of Judah ever came to the altar of the Lord? No, not at all. The need for such a radical change was so great, and it is obvious that he of whom these things are said belonged to a different tribe, to which priestly privileges does not belong to. The writer understands the law to forbid one from any tribe than that of Levi to serve at the altar. Now let's come to verse 14. Verse 14 evidently shows on the basis of his genealogies in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3. We can see in both of these gospels, we see a genealogy over there, and how Jesus comes from the tribe of Judah, a tribe from which the law of Moses said nothing so far as the priesthood is concerned. Now the priesthood has been changed, and the next verse will adduce still another proof of this. It will show another proof where Jesus is historical reality of the prediction which is mentioned in Psalm 110 verses 4. That is a priest forever. So here verses 15 to 17 simply shows that since the law allowed only the sons of Levi to be priests, it had to be revoked by God to make way for this one, that is Jesus, who possessed a priesthood not just by virtue of legal descent, but on the basis of the power of indestructible life. The Levitical priesthood did not have the power of indestructible life. And that was one of the biggest weaknesses shown by the author. And then he introduces Jesus by showing that he or Jesus is having the power of indestructible life. Now, let me tell you, the term power simply does not mean in a physical sense or in a, or authority, but it speaks of a characteristics of Christ himself, inherent in his righteous person. This was the power or might of an endless life. So Christ is a king and a priest forever. No wonder you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. That's how it is being compared. Now, let's come to verses 18 to 19. Now, this passage constitutes the summary of the writer's argument concerning the supersession of the law. When I say supersession, it means, supersedior, or how it overtakes, supersede the law. Verse 19 says, the law made nothing perfect. Do you remember what I said, the meaning of perfect, some moments ago? Does anybody remember? Hello? Yes, that's what I want to say. The word perfect in this text says a man's ability to draw near to God. Now, the author is saying the Levitical priesthood, the law made nothing perfect with regard to Levitical priesthood. They could not bring anybody to God. We can see that in Romans 8 verse 3, Galatians 2 verse 21, and then 3 verse 21 also. For it rested on a priesthood which could not perfect at all. But there was a substitution of a better hope. When I say hope, it is all about forgiveness. It is about absolution. Now, this substitution of a better hope brought people to God. Now, better is a key word in Hebrews. And we as a serious student should profit from a study of its many occurrences in this episode. The hope spoken of here has already been discussed to some extent. But now, man's relation to God is no longer one of an external ordinances, simply, but it is an inward spiritual relationship which guarantees true communion with Him. Now, what does this statement mean? As previously, the last time I said, the curtain separated man from God. That was an interpretation of how the curtain became a hindrance. But then at the time of crucifixion, when Jesus died, the curtain tore. And in a metaphorical sense, when we interpret in that way, we see that when the curtain tore, that showed us that any man could enter the presence of God through Jesus Christ, who died on the cross. Amen. Now, there are two underlying facts from verses 20 to 22. Now, one thing, when we read verses 21, let us read verse 21. But he became a priest with an oath when God said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. And then, God did not underwrite the old Levitical priesthood, but he underwrote the new priesthood this time. They became priests. In the Old Testament, we see priest becoming priest becoming a priest without an oath. A person becoming a priest without an oath. That simply means those priests were temporary. They were not at all permanent. The priest after the order of Melchizedek shows that Jesus is the guarantee of a better covenant. That is the first underlying fact. Now, what is the second underlying fact? When we read in this epistle, we see that the author is not mentioning one priest of Levite's tribe. He is mentioning as plural, as priests. That means there were multiplicity of priests. Multitude of priests were there in the Old Testament. And in contradictory to so many priests in the Old Testament, Jesus is coming as the only one new priest in the new covenant. That itself shows that how Jesus is the superior person, a superior priest of the latter ones. You see, now verses 20, 21, 22 go together. by connecting the phrases as translated from the original, in as much and by so much, in verse 20 and 22 respectively, and then including verse 21, which is, parenthetical. The author presents a ratio. Christ supersedes the Old Testament priest, the Old Testament priest by an oath appointment versus a simple appointment. So Jesus is the surety of a better testament than theirs. So it was not without an oath that Christ became priest. Bible clearly, Hebrews chapter 7 clearly says Jesus became a priest with an oath. And this is proved by a chief passage on the subject, Psalm 110 verses 4. Jehovah, or God the Father, swore to Jesus, "Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." Earlier, the Hebrews author dealt with the forever thing, right? We saw how Jesus was eternal in his priesthood. Now the author in the same phrase is giving importance to the word swear. So he is concerned with the swear. Now when we follow with verse 23 to 25, we see that death was a factor which kept a priest from continuing in office. It was not one priest staying at one place for all the time. That particular priest's work was incomplete after his death. But now we have a new priest whose work never finishes, because he is a priest forever. He is a permanent priesthood. Christ's priesthood is inviolable, and also untransferable. Jesus' position as a priest cannot be transferred to somebody else. That means he alone is able to save completely those who come to God through him. Now, verses 26 to 28. Such a high priest as Christ is just what man needs. You see, this is what exactly human being required of. It made his, Jesus became us. That is, he was fitted to our need. Man needs a priest who is holy, and therefore, a priest in the Levitical tribe, he himself was not a holy man. The word translated holy includes the idea of compassion, tender mercy, being separated. Man's priest must be undefiled and separate from sinners. But every Aaronic priest was weak. He was sinful. But what man needs is a priest who is higher than the heavens, living forever to intercede on our behalf. And that is what Jesus is doing right now. He is sitting at the right hand of the Father, right side of the Father. He is interceding for his people. This is what man needs. Christ does not need to, sacrifice for his own sins and then for the people's sins, or on a daily basis. Christ do not need to do that, because he himself did not have sin. And in the Old Testament, when we see a sheep or a lamb being offered, a clean lamb being offered. Now listen to me carefully, because this is very, 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 very important. In the Old Testament, let me tell you in the story format, in the Old Testament, how do a priest sacrifice? The sinner, what he does is, out of his wages or what he gets, he brings an animal, maybe a dove, or maybe a goat, or maybe sheep or a lamb, according to his income. So what does he do is, he brings an animal. So he goes to the outer courtyard of, the temple. Because he is not allowed to come into the inner courtyard. So he comes outside. The priest comes over here. What does he do is, he simply does not take that animal to the holies of holies, holy of holies. What he do is, he first checks the animal brought. इसके कान में कोई प्रॉब्लम है क्या, इसके मुंह में कोई प्रॉब्लम है क्या, इसके चमड़े में कोई डिफेक्ट्स है क्या. To be honest, yes, this, according to the history, when we read the Bible, it is checked. The priest checks whether this is a defectless animal. And I remember a pastor saying, beautifully saying, a sinner bringing an animal in the outer courtyard, the priest is checking whether the animal is having any defects. In the same way, Jesus as a lamb was brought to Pilate, you see, and then he goes to different places, and the priest checking on him, and Jesus proved he is without any defect. You see, you're getting me right. In the Old Testament, we see a lamb, there is no defects in the lamb. The same way, Jesus coming to the courtyard where the Jewish priests, they find no guilt in him. And in the Old Testament, the lamb, when it is assured that the lamb is very, very okay to be sacrificed, the lamb is being taken to the Holy of Holies. The same way in the New Testament, we see when Jesus is being proved not guilty, Jesus is gone to be crucified. How beautiful is that, right? You see, the same way. It is exactly the same way. But the difference is, the Levitical priest had weakness, but Jesus as a priest did not have any weakness. He was sinless, he was faultless, he was guiltless. And since he was free from all these defects, Jesus offered himself as the lamb in the Old Testament. See? Very beautiful comparison made. Now, it is not just that Jesus is becoming a priesthood. Jesus is becoming a priest in the order of Melchizedek. As said, when Jesus died, he rose again on the third day, and now he lives as a king. You see, Jesus is the ultimate priest and a king. This shows, this is what the author is trying to show. Jesus. Why? One more thing I would like to share is, why is the author deliberately bringing Levitical priest? Why is it bringing Abraham? So the answer is simple. To prove that Jesus is superior to Melchizedek, we need to know how great Melchizedek was. You see, if we come to know that Melchizedek was such a great person, more greater than the Levitical priests, more greater than Abraham, and Jesus is greater to Melchizedek, that means he is simply superior to all of them. You see, that is the comparison made over here. And Christ does not need daily to make a sacrifice for his own sins and then for the people's. He had no sin himself. He so offered himself as a perfect sacrifice for the people, a conscious, willing victim. The priests of the Old Testament offered sacrifice of unwilling, unthinking beasts whose blood could never take away. You see, in the Old Testament, the animal never knew that he is going to be sacrificed. The priest did not know that whether the animal was surrendering or not to be sacrificed. No, Jesus willingly, knowing that I am going to be the sacrifice for the people over here. He became the ultimate sacrifice. And in contrast to this, the word of the oath in verse 21, which was since the law in origin, that became, the new law. It replaced the old law. This made the Son a priest, and he is consecrated forevermore. Now, how beautiful is Charles Wesley, writing in his hymn. You ought to read it. It is a beautiful passage. And the last few verses, or the last few points which we discussed, it shows a wonderful expression in the following hymn, written in 1742 by Charles Wesley. It reads like this: Arise, my soul, arise, shake off thy guilty fears. The bleeding sacrifice in my behalf appears. Before the throne my surety stands. My name is written on his hands. He ever lives above for me to intercede. His all-redeeming love, his precious blood to plead. His blood atoned for every race, and sprinkles now the throne of grace. 5 bleeding wounds he bears, received on Calvary. They pour effectual prayers. They strongly plead for me. Forgive him, oh forgive, they cry. Nor let that ransomed sinner die. My God is reconciled. His pardoning voice I hear. He owns me for his child. I can no longer fear. With confidence I now draw nigh, and Abba, Father, Father, I cry. How beautiful this poem is, or the hymn is. You see, one of the striking things which was revealed to me was this thing: how the lamb in the Old Testament was defectless, and the lamb went for checkup in each courtyard, outer courtyard, inner courtyard, and then to the Holy of Holies. The same way, Jesus going to the courtyard of the Jewish priest. You see, if you read the Gospels carefully, it's not just one priest checking on Jesus. He's going to different priests and then found guiltless and going for sacrifice. How beautiful is Jesus as a priest who is interceding for us, sitting on the right side of the Father. So may God bless us all. I hope this class is really, making you or drawing you closer to God. So thank you so much. May God bless us all.